How you doing? Welcome to my channel.
Crates of muskets.
That's twice their word.
These men are warriors.
2 crates, no more.
Slave owner.
I had a black ophthalmologist come through here, Ellison, and we sat on this couch right here. And his great-great-granddaddy owned 68 slaves, and here I am, white, over here, and my great-great-granddaddy didn't own any slaves. And it was like somebody blew a dog whistle in a kennel. Everybody was just kind of turning their head, not knowing how to handle all this.
History tumbles you.
This is part 2 of understanding slavery as black and white Americans. In this video, I will focus mainly on the context of slavery in North America.
There is a principle which is a bar against all information. It's a proof against all argument, which cannot fail to keep man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is condemnation before investigation. The same concept is in Proverbs 18:13. He that answereth a matter before he heareth it is a folly and a shame unto him.
Last time we talked about the fact that out of millions of black African peoples taken into slavery, the United States only got 5% of that. We also talked about the fact that the white man didn't invent the Atlantic slave trade or the concept of trading slaves. 3 centuries before that, the West Africans, which are the ones that seem to get the brunt of all of it, were taken into slavery by the East Africans. We call those people Arab. We talked about the fact that the Christian religion wasn't the first religion to come along to native people and say, convert to our way of life or die or become a slave. The Arabs did it 3 centuries before that, which led to the Africans becoming Muslim. And then they took and did what was done to them to their own people in West Africa and kept it going. So that the European had no reason to wander through the villages of Africa to get slaves. If they would have tried, they would have got towed up. Even with the gun, you got to load a musket, then you got to put powder in that bad boy. You got to put a projectile down there, then you got to stuff that down there. I could have cut you up in a million pieces by the time you did that. So even with the gun, the European could not have walked up into Africa and took all those people. The Africans did the raiding and had them ready to go when the European got to the shore. We talked about the fact that the East Africans were selling black Africans and Europeans into slavery, like 1 million Europeans. Here's an example of white folks, Europeans, who basically every year go out of their way to remember the capture, the heart, and the kids have to draw like illustrations of what their ancestors went to when the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, came through there and enslaved and butchered their people. Now we're going to talk about slavery in North America. The biggest misconception that we have as black Americans and probably some white Americans is that slavery was strictly a racial thing, that white people predominantly, or really only, owned black people, and that was it. I hope we all know by now that the Pilgrims weren't the first Europeans to come over here to what's the New World and colonize it in the name of a better life. Yes, they were coming here for freedom of religion and all that, but there were people coming here from all over the world for all kind of reasons. One businessman came here to grow tobacco because it was illegal for a commoner or for a businessman or anyone else other than the government to have tobacco seeds. So ships would come over with people who couldn't pay their way. So you came here and you couldn't pay your way to get over here. You get here, you were an indentured servant, and that paid for your way over here. And at the end of your contract, you got freedom dues, which were some land and a gun or a mule or something like that. That's where we hear the term 40 acres and a mule. And the other misunderstanding too is everything was always about skin tone. No. You know, blacks and whites who were indentured servants lived together. They worked together. If they were going to run away, they conspired to run away together. And running away and trying to avoid your contract that way was the quickest way to end up as an indentured servant for life, a slave. That's the difference. That's the only difference between an indentured servant and a slave, was life. And one other misunderstanding about being an indentured servant is we think of everything in the 2016 mindset. So nowadays, animals have rights, right? So if you were an indentured servant, you did the contract. If you got out of it, tried to, indentured servants were beat just like anyone else. Mark Twain talks about flogging people who reneged on the contract when he was exploring, decided they weren't going to do it anymore. They would go retrieve them and flog them. In the military, if you were a soldier and you ran away, they bring you back and flog you in front of everyone else. So all kind of people got beat. It wasn't just black folk. Everybody got beat if you were an indentured servant and got out of line, so to speak.
I have seen an overseer beat a servant with a cane about the head till the blood has followed, for a fault that is not worth the speaking of. Truly, I have seen such cruelty there done to servants as I did not think one Christian could have done to another.
Also, as an indentured servant, you could, if you decided to have children and you didn't get permission from your master ahead of time, then you would be extended. Your time would be extended and your child would belong to the master. No question. The first real slaves in this country were indentured servants who ran away or committed a crime. There were indentured servants who had children and their time was extended, and then the children were automatically a slave for life unless the master said otherwise. So they just stay with their children. They become a slave voluntarily. So you got this one indentured servant, John Punch. He and two other European indentured servants ran away. Bounty hunters, they caught all three of them. And John Punch, the African, the black man, he was sentenced to slavery for running away. The other two just had their contracts extended, but Punch got life. That sets the stage for Anthony Johnson. He got caught up in the East Arab slave trade, and he was from Angola. He shows up over here as an indentured servant from them. He works, gets his freedom, gets a bunch of land, and he had servants himself, blacks and whites, who were his servant. It's not clear, but what we know is there was a dispute with the contract of one of his servants, John Kaiser, a black man, an African. He basically ran away, went to work for another plantation owner named Parker, and then sued Anthony Johnson for his freedom. Anthony Johnson obviously got ticked off about that, and he sued Parker, the white the white plantation owner, for Kaiser, and got Kaiser for life. Now, I want you to think about, Punch, Kaiser, both those men, African descent, got sentenced to slavery for running away. There were whites who got sentenced to slavery for running away too. We don't talk about them. But the other two, in the case of Punch, their contracts were extended. Punch, he was given life. Same thing with Kaiser, he was given life. So why do you think that is? This is what I think. We think everything's always skin tone because it's part of the narrative. But think about it. Indentured servants is the same thing as being an illegal immigrant. Now, that's a hard life. You don't have no rights. You're at the mercy of your employer, but they may figure whatever you're giving them is better than where they come from, so they'll deal with it. But, what is the reason here? And when you think about it, nobody really has that much of a problem with immigrants because of their skin tone. That's what we think everything is, but you don't have a problem with Mexicans because they're Mexican, necessarily. There are people who do think like that, but for the vast majority, it's what? Language barrier. Language barrier. That's what it is. And I think that at this point in time, the Irishmen, the Dutchmen, whatever, they had an easier time with the English language. If you listen to people who talk with an Irish accent in the 1800s, you can barely tell the difference, especially if they refined it. You can barely tell the difference between them and an Englishman if you're an American or with a Western accent. So, language barrier. That's why I think that the African was easier to deal with as far as becoming a slave, even a slave for life, because they didn't speak the language. They didn't write or read the language. And so this is a letter that was from Virginia giving John Kaiser his emancipation. But I think Johnson argued, and I think that was part of it as well. Language barrier. And then later on, it just became easier. Oh yeah, well, they're inferior to us, but I think that came much later. The real drive was money and making money and having cheap labor versus skin tone.
In 1802, a white plantation owner named William Ellison lent one of his young slaves, April, to work for a gin maker in Winnsboro. April quickly became the go-to man for repairing the expensive cotton gins throughout the Sumter area.
They send him out to the plantations and they take them apart. He would sharpen them on location. And that's
changed his name. April was now known as William Ellison, the name of his former white owner. His gin business prospered. He bought this home, hundreds of acres of land, and eventually 68 slaves to work that land. Chronicles Ellison's life in the antebellum South and suggests that his slaves were the worst fed and clothed of any in Stateburg. It also suggests that Ellison was a slave breeder, selling off infant girls. A poem in wealthy Stateburg, he bought it directly from former Governor Stephen Miller, a governor and former slave trading property. He was the wealthiest black man in South Carolina, the fourth wealthiest in the South, wealthier than more than 90% of whites.
Just on the side, this ain't black pride. Like, ooh, look at us, we had slaves. And it's not black hate. It's just raw history. Marion Jones, just listen, he does a whole narrative in the UK of the names of the people who had slaves.
Free blacks who actually owned slaves. Now, during this period of time, in this country, there were actually 4 million blacks. And of that 4 million, about 250,000 of them were actually free. As we take the time to study who owned slaves relative to the size of the population in this country, be it black, white, or Native American, blacks own a larger percentage of slaves as it relates to the other races that were here. There's also evidence that blacks owned white slaves. And then some black people in this country bought slaves. And I'm not saying every black that were free actually owned slaves, but a large number did. Since 1654, continuing right through the Civil War, blacks owned slaves. Now, we can actually stop right there and just throw this in that the very first slave owner in this country was a black guy named Anthony Johnson. And if you don't believe me, look him up yourself. The very first slave owner in this country was a guy named Anthony Johnson. Now, as we review these numbers, it is too extensive of a list to include every black person that owned slaves. I'm only going to include everybody that owned 10 or more slaves. A lot of times those who own less than 10 were actually owning family members, and there was a sign of benevolence so that they could keep the family intact. So I'll respect that. So we'll start off with John Carruthers Stanley, who was born a slave in Creighton County, North Carolina. He was the son of an Igbo mother, and Igbo is a tribe of people in southeastern Nigeria. They're still prevalent today. And her master, who was John Wright Stanley. He became an extraordinarily successful barber and speculator in real estate in New Bern. As Lawrence Winninger points out in Black Property Owners in the South, by the early 1820s, Stanley owned 3 plantations and 163 slaves, and even hired 3 white overseers to manage his property. He fathered 6 children with a slave woman named Kitty, and he eventually freed them. So in Clark County, Alabama, we have a guy named P.T. Harris who owned 24 slaves and David Monarch who owned 27. In Mobile County, Alabama, Jane Seymour owned 10 slaves and Louisa Chastain owned 14. In the city of Mobile, Alabama, Bernardaz Rosie Este owned 14 and Madame Beauchamp owned 16. In Escambia County, Florida, Euphron Hennard owned 12. In St. Johns County, Florida, Gabriel Perpall owned 39 slaves. In Greene County, Georgia, Betsy Perry owned 25 slaves. In Anne Arundel County, Maryland, Richard Horwood owned 39 slaves. M. Meade owned 17. Richard Chase owned 15. Henry Manitier owned 17. Phillips Leitner owned 11. In Second Collection District of Maryland, Pompey Preston owned 11. And in Calvert County, Maryland, Sarah Skinner owned 13. In Allen's Fresh District, Maryland, John Hungerford owned 39.
We, as black people, were victimized, but we also were beneficiaries, and we were participants as well. That's all history as well. And there is no moral high ground that anybody can stand on to say evil's been done to us, but we haven't done it to nobody else. Nobody's righteous. No, not one.
We must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred.